Overall, the quality of life of the majority of the world's population is going down. And the system might work for you. Hey, the system works for me. But just because it works for me doesn't mean it works. I won the lottery. I was born in America. And I can get a decent job because I'm a teacher. I have a state guaranteed salary. That's great. But if I were born just about anywhere else, right now, I wouldn't get to take Saturday to come talk to all y'all, and y'all wouldn't get to come to school to learn and better yourself, because you'd have to work 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, just to get enough food on the table for you and your family. And hey, never mind living in America, there are a lot of people right here in Bellingham who don't get to go to college because they got to work for their families. There are a lot of people right here in Washington who are going broke, getting thrown out of their houses. All right? And so here we come. Let's talk about poverty. Let's talk about how this happens. How do you get to a point that you can work 40 hours a week, 50 weeks a year, and you're still not making it? What happened to the American dream? How do you work 60 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, and you still don't make it? How can you work so hard and get so little? It's just wrong. You can't stand up and say the system works when you're putting half the American population in real poverty. Let's not talk about this bogus poverty line based on the food basket. That's, nah. That thing doesn't even come close to working. You want to do real data? The Economic Policy Institute, EPI.org, I believe. Great site. Check it out. They have what's called a family budget calculator. And what they do is they go to different places, and they got a whole bunch for here in Washington, Bellingham included, and they tabulate how much do you need to buy food, clothing, housing, healthcare, education. And for families, they include child care in there and transportation, because you got to drive to work. If you've seen gas prices, you know that's getting harder. And they add that up, and they say, what does a family actually need to stay out of poverty? What does a family actually need to afford the big five? In Bellingham, it's about $42,000 a year for a family of four. So if you've got two adults at the poverty line of about $19,000, you're not making it. You're $4,000 in debt every year. If nothing happens to you. Because if something happens to you, you don't have health insurance. Your car breaks down. Can you afford to get it fixed? More debt. How do you work so hard and end up with so little? How do we say a system that leaves these people work so hard, got unlucky enough to get stuck in a place without a good education? Maybe their parents weren't home to help them out. Maybe their parents didn't make it, they grew up an orphan. How do we say a system that leaves these people out in the cold works? Because it doesn't. And so we've seen the nature of these things. We've looked at the pointy end, the big sharp bit. And there are some very expensive pundits who are going to come on TV and go, oh, capitalism, greatest economic system in the world. Howard Dean, in 2004, 2000, when he was running for president, or was it 2004? Anybody?
2004.
Whatever.
What do you think?
He said, he got up in front of a group of people and goes, capitalism is the greatest economic system in the world. As if anyone thought he was a communist. But the position of the Democratic Party is capitalism works, but it doesn't. Very expensive pundits get up in front of people and go, it works. If you take part in the system, you'll be better off. The rising tide will raise all boats. Smile, clap harder. But it doesn't. And no amount of me telling you that Kopesh was a butter knife was going to convince you it wasn't for chopping people's heads off. Now, no amount of someone getting on a TV and going, well, just work harder and you'll be fine, should convince you it will be. Because just because the system works for you doesn't mean it works for everybody. And it doesn't. And so for-profit production has led us to one of the greatest contradictions in the world. Farm subsidies. And I love farm subsidies. I love it because they're crazy. They're completely insane. Because farm subsidies are there to keep prices high and keep prices low. Yes, that's right. They need to be high and low. How is that possible? It's possible because of this right here. If you are in a system where you only create things that are going to make you money, if only half the population can afford food, food will only be grown for half the population. Let me repeat that. I want to let it sink in, because it sounds a little different. If only half the population can afford to buy the food that you make, you are not going to make food for the people who can't buy it. That's how you lose money. You don't make things no one can buy. And so it really is, oh, well, people without cell phones, we're not going to make cell phones for them because they can't afford it. Fine. But food, only half the population can afford food. Food will only be grown for half the population. And so now we have these crazy farm subsidies. And what this graph shows is the red down here, this is the total portion of these pre-tax farm profits that are made up by subsidies from the government. Let's remember that the government's money is our money. We pay taxes. So this is us paying farms to produce food we then buy. And so at some points you see the profits, they spike over here, farm subsidies go down. But then you get into the 80s. About 2/3 of total profit from these, of all the money that these corporations made, was paid for by the government. You get into here, where almost half of all the money that these big corporate mega farms are making is coming from the government. Why? I thought we were a capitalist society. I thought the free market ruled. Because food prices got to be high, and they got to be low. They got to be high enough that the companies making this food can break even. If it costs you $5 to make a bushel of wheat, you can't charge people $4 for that wheat. You got to charge more than $5, or you're going out of business. But on the other hand, we can afford $5 for a loaf of bread. So farm prices got to be low. They got to be low enough so that the people in the country can actually afford to buy the food that they're going to eat. Which leaves us with this problem, because we can't afford to pay what farmers need to break even. And they're going to go out of business if they charge us what we can afford to pay. So the government's got to make up that difference. And that's what this big red blob is. This is the government making up that difference between high need and low prices. When you have a system that produces for profit, you create these kinds of contradictions. We need food. We need housing. But the market doesn't provide it for us at the price that we can afford. And so the government leaves a lot of things. The government doesn't give you a car allowance. The government doesn't give you a TV allowance. But if people start going hungry, well, I have a saying, it's PPGP. Poor people get pissed. And enough people go hungry, they start getting guns. And then you have a problem. And so the government pays these farmers to keep prices low. This is not producing for need. This is not producing what people need. It's producing what's going to make this guy a ton of money and convince him, oh, yeah, still produce the food that we want. And speaking of those guys, anyone know how to calculate productivity? No econ majors in here? Productivity is often thought of as a very complicated process, but it's not. It's an incredibly simple equation. Productivity is the amount of money you make for your company an hour over the amount of money they pay you an hour. That's it. It's output over input. So if I'm paid $10 an hour to make chairs, and every hour I make a chair worth $20, my productivity is too. And so we can see over the last about 60 years now, productivity has been pretty linear. And back up until about 1973, wages kept pace. That as we became more productive and we produced more value for these corporations, our wages went up a corresponding amount. And that's good. Because if you work hard, you should get more. But right about here, something happens. Companies start realizing, hey, I have an idea. If we pay our workers less, we'll make more money. And they still have to work for us. Because if they quit, they can't pay rent. We've got it over a barrel. And so they do. They start outsourcing jobs. Because the quickest way a company increases productivity is firing. This is what layoffs are. Because if you employ 100 people and they make 100 chairs an hour, and you fire 50 of those people and they still make 100 chairs an hour, you just doubled your productivity. And you cut your wage, the amount you have to pay in wages in half. Profits go up. Profits are good. And so since 1973, wages have been essentially stagnant. The actual buying power of the American workforce has remained flat. Is that a question?
Yeah. Why 1973? There was the oil crisis, but why?
The oil crisis is kind of a chimera because the oil crisis was created a lot by the U.S. oil policy.
Right.
And so what really happened here was we came to a point where after